Okay, this video is purely dedicated towards answering relative price questions. A pretty difficult area of the study guide. It's important you're using exactly the correct language. So just a couple of examples off the bat about examples of changes in relative prices and where resources will flow. So for example, if we're looking at the tax on carbon tax shifts the supply curve to the left for non-renewable energy, increases the relative price of coal-based energy, that lowers the relative price of renewable energy. Because it's now got a lower relative price than its substitute, that will increase the demand for solar energy, which technically leads to a higher price of solar energy as well. But more resources will flow into solar energy because of the higher price. It's got a higher price, but that's caused by demand as opposed to higher cost of production. So the relative price of solar energy increases compared to other products, and resources will flow into solar energy. If we're looking at a lower price of oil due to excess supply, resources may actually shift out of oil in the long term, because if there's a excess supply, it's actually less profitable for individual sellers to be in that industry. But in terms of the impact on LPG, it will lead to a higher relative price of LPG, which is bad for LPG because that'll reduce demand. So the demand curve for LPG will shift to the left, which will lead to a lower price and resources flowing out of LPG. Self-interested, profit-motivated producers would prefer to produce other products that are more profitable and therefore will shift their land, labour and capital elsewhere. Other industries that may suffer from lower oil prices include bicycle industries, because more people might drive, public transport, because more people might drive, and then any industry that doesn't rely on oil for production could potentially suffer. Industries that would benefit would include anyone that uses oil in production, so manufacturing industries, transportation, so transporting using trucks and stuff because they use oil, and the car industry would benefit. There'd be more demand for cars as well. Subsidies for solar energy, that would reduce the relative price of solar energy, which would encourage more investment in these areas because it's reducing the cost of production. It'll lead to less demand for non-renewable energy, that should say. So sorry, there should be a non in front of that because it will have a higher relative price, and resources will flow into solar energy because it's now being subsidised and is more profitable. Okay, so in terms of this answer, explain why lower petrol prices are likely to see more resources move out of the industry for LPG. Use the term relative prices in your answer. So first things first, say that a decrease in petrol prices will result in a lower relative price for petrol compared to LPG, or a higher relative price of LPG. This is what you don't want to do. Don't say that the decrease in relative price for petrol will lead to a shift in petrol to the right. It's got a lower price. That means it's an expansion in the demand for petrol, not a shift. So this language here will result in you only getting a 1 out of 3. Okay, in terms of this answer here, lower petrol prices will decrease the relative price of petrol. The substitute product LPG will therefore have a relatively higher price. Therefore, the demand curve for LPG will shift to the left, causing a surplus. To reduce the surplus, the price of LPG will be reduced, causing the demand to expand. Self-interested producers will shift resources out of the production of LPG because it's now less profitable. Rather than saying that they'll shift into petrol, we don't know if petrol is more profitable. What we know is LPG is not profitable, or not as profitable as what it was. So this last paragraph should say, self-interested producers will shift resources, land, labour and capital out of the production of LPG, as it is now relatively less profitable due to the lower price. Okay. Referring to relative prices, explain why the abolition or the removal of the carbon tax should result in fewer resources being allocated to renewable energy. It's a very similar question using the same logic. Relative prices refer to the price of one good or service in compared to another. The removal of the carbon tax is likely to reduce the price of non-renewable energy sources because they'll face lower costs of production. This should see an increase in the relative price of renewable energy. As the relative price of non-renewable energy is now lower compared to renewable energy, consumers will substitute out of renewable energy and back into non-renewables. This can be seen by a shift in the demand curve to the left for solar energy. The decrease in the demand will lead to a lower price, and self-interested, profit-motivating producers will shift resources out of the market due to the lower profits on offer. Explain how the price mechanism can solve a potential shortage of miners during the mining boom. This is a question that people struggle with a little bit. First of all, define the price mechanism. So again, the price mechanism refers to the way in which changes in demand and supply in a competitive market determine where resources are allocated. A potential shortage of miners during the mining boom will result in an increase in wages. Now think about how we actually solve shortages. Generally, we raise the price. In the labour market, the price is the wage. So in this case here, you need to articulate that the wage increases. That then acts as an incentive or causes an expansion. That should say supply, not demand. That's actually wrong. It's an expansion in supply of workers. And this because the increased wage acts as an incentive for them to reallocate their labour resources into the mining industry. So they may go from other areas, like teaching or working as an engineer in some other field, or working as a truck driver in another field, into the mining industry. That gets rid of the shortage, and therefore helps to achieve and get rid of the shortage in that case. The higher wage can also lead to a contraction in demand because firms might become more capital intensive. Okay, again, these are very similar questions, common questions with relative prices. So explain how a change in relative prices will result in a reallocation of resources. Okay, how do a change in relative prices reallocate resources? So what you're getting asked is, how does a change in the price of one thing compared to another impact on where we allocate our land, labour and capital? So relative price is the price of one good or service compared to the price of another good or service. A change in relative prices acts as the signal for where self-interested producers shift their land, labour and capital. If a good or service has an increase in relative price because of more demand, okay, that's important that you distinguish that. Self-interested, keywords here, self-interested, profit-motivated producers will shift their resources into production of that good or service because they will now have a higher relative profit. For example, during the mining boom, the increased demand caused by China's growth increased the relative price of commodities like iron ore and coal. This then acted as a signal for self-interested producers to reallocate their resources, land, labour and capital, into the industry for iron ore and coal. And then explain what that means. Suppliers already in the market expanded their supply by utilising spare miners and making them work longer hours. Those who are in other areas, so for example mining diamonds, started to mine coal or iron ore. Land that was used for schools was reallocated to mining. Many engineers, labourers, etc. started to work in the mines as well as a result of the increase in the relative wage. So you've clearly articulated what relative prices are, how they determine what's produced in a free market, and provided a clear-cut example of a product changing in relative price and how resources flow into that market. Okay. Another question, explain with reference to the role of relative prices how resources are allocated in a highly competitive market. In your answer, explain how relative prices impact how a highly competitive market answers the questions of what and how to produce. This is a 5-mark question. So first thing, a highly competitive market assumes the limited government regulations. Resources are free to move based on demand and supply and relative prices. Relative prices send signals to producers and consumers which affect their incentives and choices. An increase in the relative price of a good relative to another will generally encourage producers to reallocate more resources to that good, if assuming that's caused by an increase in demand. For example, and then you use a shorter example here maybe because you're going to talk about how to produce as well, an increase in the price of strawberries without an increase in the price of raspberries may encourage farmers to reallocate his or her land, labour and capital towards production of strawberries, as using resources will use the highest profit. E.g., they might use existing land that was once used for raspberries, or people that were picking raspberries will now pick strawberries, etc. The relative price, and then how does it affect how to produce? The relative price of factors of production can also affect what concentration or what resources firms use in production. For example, large wage rises are granted. The increase in the price of labour may increase. This may encourage firms to reduce their employment of labour and instead use capital. So the relative price of labour compared to capital determines which of those two things we use more of. A couple of other examples. In a competitive market, what's one factor that might cause a change in relative prices? Okay, a competitive market is free of government intervention. One factor could be climate conditions. If there's a natural disaster like a cyclone, that could increase the relative price of fruits like bananas in compared to other products. This is because the supply curve will shift left and cause a shortage of bananas. Producers need to raise the price to get rid of the shortage. This will increase the price of bananas relative to other goods and services. Other examples, fashion, age distribution. So you could talk about something that's more popular with more old people. Don't use things like substitutes and complements. It's not what these questions are about. You need to explain what caused the price of that product to increase in the first place. So don't say like coffee will decrease in relative price if tea becomes more expensive. What's the factor that actually caused that? So talk about something like climatic conditions, fashion, or age distribution. Okay, a couple of multiple choice questions that people found tricky. Which of the following is likely to lead to an expansion in the demand for vaccinations? Okay, this was a really tricky question for people. So we're looking at something that would cause a lower price of vaccinations because that's what causes an expansion in demand. The first one, a grant paid directly to parents to encourage them to vaccinate their children. Well, if we give parents a grant, that's going to increase the demand for vaccinations, so the demand will shift to the right. That will actually lead to a higher price of vaccinations, if that's the only intervention, and that wouldn't lead to an expansion in demand because the price is going up. The No Jab, No Pay initiative, which reduces government subsidies to families who don't vaccinate their children. Again, what happens here is that you get subsidies for childcare if you vaccinate your children. So if they implement that initiative, again, that's going to increase the demand for vaccinations. You're not getting subsidised to vaccinate your children. Your subsidies are for childcare, which then will therefore not be given to you if you don't vaccinate your children. So if I said to you, you get subsidies for childcare if you buy your kids Mars bars, then the Mars bars are going to experience increase in demand. There's no reason why Mars bar prices would go down if people are getting a subsidy to go to childcare if they give their kids Mars bars. They're not getting a subsidy for Mars bars. They're getting a subsidy for childcare if their kids eat Mars bars. So the demand for Mars bars would go up. In this case, the demand for vaccinations goes up. I don't know if that was a good example. A subsidy paid to hospitals to reduce their cost of providing vaccinations. That's going to be something that affects their cost of production, and therefore that would lower the price of vaccinations and would lead to the supply curve shifting to the right. That's what's going to cause the expansion in demand because prices would go down. Government funding advertising campaigns outlining the benefits of vaccinations. Again, that's going to increase the demand for vaccinations and lead to a higher price. The correct answer is therefore C, because that's the only one that leads to a lower price. Which of the following is one of the necessary conditions for the existence of a perfectly competitive market? Okay. Again, there's sort of double negatives here. So which one would occur in a perfectly competitive market? The absence of asymmetric information, that's the same as saying there's perfect information. That's a condition of a perfectly competitive market. Zero freedom of entry, well, that's the opposite. There's complete freedom of entry. So that's not true. A relatively small number of buyers and sellers, no, there's a lot. And the existence of product differentiation, no. In a perfectly competitive market, they're the same. The correct answer is A, the absence of asymmetric information is the same as saying there's perfect information. A couple of more questions. In 2016, the price of avocados spiked to approximately $7 each, so the price went up. Which one is unlikely to cause this? Bushfires, well, that will reduce supply, higher prices. Excessive rain, again, reduces supply and leads to higher prices. High demand leads to higher prices. Some growers flooding the market with avocados means there's more supply. That leads to a lower price. That's the correct answer because that wouldn't lead to an increase in price. In the market for Ferraris, a decrease in the price of Lamborghinis, okay, in combination with a decrease in productivity by Ferrari makers is likely to lead to which of the following? You draw your curves. Okay, let's look at the shifts that occur. There's a decrease in the price of Lamborghinis. Well, that's a substitute. That would shift the demand curve to the left because the substitute's cheaper. And a decrease in productivity by Ferrari manufacturers would shift the supply curve to the left because it's a negative supply side factor. So in this case here, we look at the new equilibrium, which is around here. That's the old equilibrium there. We've clearly experienced no change in price, but the quantity sold is lower. So the correct answer would be the equilibrium price will not change, or we don't know, so the correct answer is A. The other thing you could think about there is, if there's less demand for your product, which is what the lower price of Lamborghinis will do, and there's a less supply, that means we don't know if there's a shortage or surplus because we've got less demand and less supply at the old price. Because we don't know if there's a shortage or surplus, we don't know if the price is going to change, therefore the answer is A. Which of the following microeconomic demand or supply side factors would lead to a lower price for solar panels in the future? Higher electricity prices charged by the major energy retailers. Well, that would lead to more demand for solar panels, which would lead to a higher price of solar panels. It's not A. The development of newer technology that is more efficient and cheaper than solar energy, that would shift the demand curve to the left for solar energy, and therefore would lead to a lower price of solar panels. So that's the correct answer. In terms of why the other ones are wrong, advances in battery technology enabling longer storage of solar generated power, that's actually going to shift the demand curve to the right because more people will want solar power because it's a better product. It's like saying if the battery in the iPhone increased and could last for 2 or 3 days, then more people would want them and the price would go up. So that's not the correct answer. And an increase in the price of factors of production would lead to a higher price because it's going to shift the supply curve to the left. Thank you.